5G was introduced in Sweden and many other countries in 2020. This new technology is intended to provide much faster transmission speed, and it uses higher frequencies than 3G and 4G. 5G emit 10 to 100 times higher levels of microwave radiation than previous systems. The 5G started to be deployed without any study being performed previously investigating the health impacts from this new technology.
I'm a medical doctor, oncologist, so I have been treating cancer patients. My research into environmental agents and cancer risk started with the Agent Orange stuff that was used in Sweden too. That was in the 1960s and 70s, and I met back in 1980s or late 1970s patients with a special type of cancer that have been spraying in the woods with this Agent Orange stuff. And at that time it was not widely known that there was a dioxin problem, a TCDD problem. I went on with other studies on persistent organic pollutants like PCB and cancer risks and so on. And finally, during the last 2 decades or a bit more, studying the radio frequency radiation and cancer risks. So we have published a number of studies on cancer risks, mainly on using the mobile phone and the risk for tumors in the brain, glioma, and also on the hearing nerve, acoustic neurinoma, which were confirmed in our studies and also in other to be about 2 to 3 times increased risk if you have used the mobile phone for a substantial number of years, 10 years or more. And from that on we have moved to look into the environmental exposure to radio frequencies mostly from base stations, which is a really growing problem with the introduction of 5G, etc.
I'm a journalist. Usually you call it like an investigative reporter, and also done a lot of documentaries, especially in the field of radio. And so I've been working many years for the Swedish public service, for the radio mostly, and some TV also. And then since a few years back I started my own channel, which is called Folkets Radio, the People's Radio. I think this was also, in the time when they were introducing 5G. I was acquainted with a guy who was driving around in Stockholm and measuring in people's homes. So I was offered to go along with him for a day. So I brought my recorder and my microphone, and we were riding around Stockholm and meeting people who were complaining about this. There was especially one place in Kista, a suburb to Stockholm, where a woman, I think of Iranian descent, she was complaining that there was tons of these antennas on her roof just above her ceiling. And her daughter was waking up in the middle of the night with nose bleeding and all kinds of problems. And she was really desperate. So I made an interview with her, and it was heartbreaking, really. But I didn't feel anything. So I said, could you show me one place in this apartment where you think it's really bad? So she said, well, here is this kitchen table. We don't use this anymore because people who come here, even if they have no prior knowledge, they ask, is there something strange in this apartment? So I said, okay. So I sat there and I started my clock, and and my tape recorder. And in 1 minute and 2 minutes and nothing happened, 3 minutes. But then after like 4 minutes, it started pinching in my hand, in the arm. And it sort of gets stronger and stronger. So after like 7 minutes, I decided, yeah, I do feel something. So I sort of, and then we thanked her. And then when I came down from the elevator, it was like an elephant had been standing on my chest. I lost my breath, and I was completely, dehydrated. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds, and that was sort of the first time that I really felt, wow, this really has some impact.
The fact that 5G was to be deployed without any previous safety studies upset a number of scientists that called for safety studies to be done before the 5G deployment. They were concerned that due to the increasing radiation exposure and the use of new frequencies, 5G would lead to potential serious health consequences. They also stressed that harmful effects from previous systems like 2G, 3G and the 4G were already shown to appear well below the levels expected from the 5G antennas.
And then I think 1 or 2 years later I was moving in here and I was feeling sort of pain in my chest. And I think normally I wouldn't have any, I would just wonder why do I have that? But since I was working with this topic, it came to my mind, what if actually this 5G tower is affecting me? So I asked one of the people that I interviewed who has this kind of meter, IMF meter, if he could come to my place and measure. And so he did, and he said, oh, it's quite high actually in your bedroom.
The Swedish Radiation Protection Foundation was contacted by a number of people complaining of various symptoms such as sleeping problems, headaches, dizziness, heart problems after 5G base stations had been deployed close to their apartments or houses. This is exactly the same symptoms that had been identified in scientific studies during the last 25 years among people living close to mobile phone masts. Dr. Lennart Hardell then suggested that we should investigate the health effects and radiation levels from 5G. We have this far published 8 case studies and one summary of the studies. Shockingly, these case studies are this far the only studies that have investigated health impacts on people exposed to 5G in real life.
This type of research is not done in other places, as far as I know, around the world. But these have been case reports, people who have talked about their symptoms after 5G was implemented on the building or on the other side of the street, and they get these typical symptoms as you can include them in the microwave syndrome, with headache, fatigue, difficulties to sleep, etc. There can be muscle pains and problems from the stomach and from the heart, of course, too. So there's quite a lot of symptoms, and they can develop very quickly when you are exposed, in contrast to cancer, which we haven't studied, which is a long-term effect. I mean, 5G started some 4 or 5 years ago in Sweden, 2020, and the cancer effect will come up after 10, 15 or 20 years. You have both the cancer risk in long term, but you have these acute symptoms, which some people develop, others do not. Many may have them, but they are not aware of the connection with the radio frequency radiation. Furthermore, this is like classic provocation studies, because most of these people have had to leave their office or homes to another place for living, and then their symptoms disappear within a very short time, within a few days.
I have lived in my apartment almost 30 years, and I had base stations near my apartment for many years, 3G, 4G, but after they upgraded to 5G, they put up a lot of more antennas. It was 3 times bigger, the antenna elements, and what worried me, I saw that they were pointing it directly to my apartment, and they placed it on a house that was lower than the house I was living in, so it was directly in front of my house. And I measured later on that it was around 22 meters away from my apartment. During the first week I started to notice that pattern, that each night around 10 or 11 I sensed a hard beating of my heart, and it continued during all night until I left my home. And I remember when the weekend came, my heart was beating non-stop Friday night until Monday morning. I was out of energy, started to get headaches, and I had visit of my ex, and she immediately felt, after half an hour sitting in my living room, she felt pain in her brain and started to crying and asked me what is happening, what is this? Is this the antenna, 5G antenna? What's happening here? I november 2021 så efter att ha bott i samma hus i ungefär 10 år så märker jag hur det börjar slamra på taket. Och efter mycket om men fick jag reda på att det var en av de större mobiloperatörerna i Sverige som skulle montera nya antenner på taket. 5G då bland annat. Innan det här hände så fanns det en befintlig basstation på taket med en äldre version då. Så jag kände till att man kunde mäta mikrovågsstrålning så jag kontaktade en man som kunde mäta upp det här ordentligt då innan det här var installerat. Så vi fick de mätvärden före de här 5G-masterna installerades.
När man hade kopplat in 5G då så fick jag väldigt snabbt och tydligt symptom. När jag kände att allting, det bara var fel i kroppen. Jag fick huvudvärk, yrsel, tinnitus, det stack i huden. Och jag försökte lägga mig i ett annat rum. Det var lite bättre där men inte mycket. Jag var ju medveten om det här att det finns något som heter placeboeffekt. Att tankar och känslor påverkade. Så jag provade verkligen mig själv. Hur fungerade jag och hur var jag på min arbetsplats? Ute, inne, i olika rum och hemma hos andra och sådär. Och det slutade alltid med att samma symptom kom när jag kom hem och speciellt då uttalat i sängen.
Det vi gjorde då när vi insåg att det här var i drift, det var att jag igen kontaktade den här mannen då som utförde mätningar, mikrovågsmätningar. Och då fann vi ju, eller han sa så här att med de strålningsvärden som vi då uppmätte så sa han: här kan ni inte bo, packa era väskor. Före installationen med den då gamla befintliga utrustningen mätte vi 6000 mikrowatt per kvadratmeter. Och efter installationen när den var fullt i driftstagen så mätte vi då minst 2,5 miljoner mikrowatt per kvadratmeter. Och det slog i botten. Speciellt på Kerstins sida av sängen där av någon konstig anledning. Men antennen satt alltså precis ovanför vårt sovrum, 5-7 meter därifrån. Så det gjorde vi. Vi packade våra väskor och nu hade jag tillgång till en liten etta på 30 kvadratmeter där vi då fick dra ut en bäddsoffa och bo då. Vi flyttade ner till kontoret. Jag var bortrest sen i 2 veckor. När jag kom tillbaka så provade jag att bo själv i lägenheten. Det var då mina symptom kom. Och det var sömnsvårigheter, hudrodnad, tinnitus, näsblod fick jag, yrsel. Så då insåg jag ju att jag kan inte bo här heller. Jag får flytta ner också tillsammans med Kerstin då på vår lilla lokal. Och där försvann ju både dina och mina symptom inom någon eller några dagar. Så det var ganska uppenbart att de här symptomen kom ifrån vår lägenhet, det som var på taket.
We had some cases where we had measurements before. They were not low, but it was another technology. It may be some 1,000 microwatts per square meter. But at that time it was 3G and 4G, the types of radiation that were before 5G. But when 5G was installed, they get symptoms very quickly. So it's interesting that these people could actually tolerate the previous generations, but with 5G they got all these myriads of symptoms.
It was an extreme pain I never felt before in my life. It's the strongest pain I ever experienced, and it happened a couple of times, and I thought like I was going to die. So I started to connect the dots, and I just understood it's something wrong with the antenna. This is dangerous. I need to get out of here. I could stay at different places. That saved my situation. Else I would have been forced to move into a hotel. I was kind of scared that if I could not solve this situation, I was afraid I could become homeless. Every time I was revisiting my apartment to pick up my belongings, my symptoms became more severe every time. And I started to notice a pattern that within like 6 or 8 hours, the symptoms appeared. And it could go on until the next day. Also, I noticed I got headaches for 5 days. I had hard working during that time. I became more sensitive to RF exposure, that I could not even hold my computer mouse that was Bluetooth without extreme pain. I have been using that for years. All of a sudden I could not hold it. I started to notice more and more sensitivity for RF exposure, and even more I got exposed in my apartment, this sensitivity increased.
Our governments and the industry claim that there are no health risks with the 5G radiation because we have so-called safety limits that protect us against harm. However, they only protect against immediate heating effects that were observed from an hour of extremely high exposure. In consequence, they do not protect against any other effects from long-term exposure, for instance, cancer, sleeping problems, headaches, heart problems, or any other harmful effects that are not due to heating. Therefore, most scientists consider that these limits are insufficient to protect against health hazards. So why are the limits not more protective? The answer is that they are important for the industry. These limits that most countries have adopted are recommended by influential organizations such as the ICNIRP, the World Health Organization, and the European Commission. Both the ICNIRP and the World Health Organization have been criticized for defending the interests of the industry rather than public health. For many years, the World Health Organization even received funding from the telecommunications industry for promoting these limits, and the ICNIRP has also been criticized for having ties to the industry.
There is something with this technology, because it's rapid onset and rapid off, called MIMO, multiple inputs and multiple outputs of the radiation. So it's a bombarding of the human body, and it seems to be especially problematic. And one mechanism could be that there is not very much recover. I mean, usually if you go on cellular level and get a toxin or on a radiation, there can be some damage, but there is also a reparation mechanism in the cells. This cannot be done with 5G because it's so rapid and it's so very high pulses. So they get these toxicological effects on the human body. I mean, this is used in radiotherapy, radiation of cancer. Now, instead of giving the dose once a day, we can divide it and give the dose twice, one dose of the radiation in the morning and another in the afternoon. And we know that the same dose is much more toxic to the cancer cell if it's divided in 2 doses during the day. This has to do with the repair mechanism. So the body doesn't have the time to repair the effect of the radiation when it's given with the short intervals.
So I become very sensitive to Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. When I moved to another apartment, I became very sick. I was still in a very bad shape, and I was extremely sensitive to all form of RF exposure. So that's a problem. When you get affected, you can't live in an apartment almost anymore, because there is so huge exposure today, even from your neighbors, because they have Bluetooth speakers, they have Wi-Fi routers, they have mesh networks. We have built a society that makes people sick today.
This is a presentation that a representative of the Ericsson company held in 2017 on the impact of EMF limits on the 5G network rollout. The exclusion zone is the zone where people cannot live or stay for longer periods. If Ericsson has to adapt to limits that are 100 times lower, or in other words, 100 times stricter than the ICNIRP limits, the exclusion zone would be this big compared to the exclusion zone of ICNIRP limits, which is only this area. So it has a huge consequence for Ericsson, and they conclude here, size of exclusion zone with 100 times lower ICNIRP limits makes 5G network rollout a major problem or impossible.
On the other side here, lots of base stations for 5G. I think we can count to 8, and they are located very close to the people who are walking around and close to the heads of people, of course, because it's just one flat building like that. And we have very high exposure here. It's just now we have some 14, 15 volts per meter, but we have measured much higher before. I mean, if you move around and come into the direction of the beam, it will be even higher, maybe 30, 40 volts per meter, which is very close to 50 volts per meter, where you have an increased cancer risk in animal studies. So this place is definitely not safe, and also a place where you can get this microwave syndrome, or the symptoms which are created by radiofrequency radiation. The old town is very crowded by buildings and very narrow streets between, and so they put very high exposure, high radiation from the base stations just to get into the old town. I mean, it's a technology which is badly designed and also badly controlled by the society. And of course people don't understand or are unaware of this, because the radiation doesn't smell it, you can't see it, you can't feel it, etc. So it's a classical environmental agent which you don't know that this is a risk factor. Actually, it's the same with dioxins that are group 1 carcinogens in humans. You can't smell them, you can't feel them, and you can't taste them. It's quite similar. It's a silent cancer agent that we are now having in our surrounding, and that is increasing in the level, of course.
Exposure limits for harmful emissions are normally set to protect the public, and then the industry has to adapt to the limits. But in this case, the limits are rather set to protect the industry's needs. This has become evident ahead of the 5G rollout. The industry put pressure on countries and regions with lower limits than those from the ICNIRP and the World Health Organization to let the limits be less protective, for instance Italy, Brussels and Switzerland. Otherwise 5G could not be deployed.
I have made measurements around 10 schools in Örebro, my hometown, and there is a very high radiation on the schoolyard. It's tens of thousands of microwatts, like 30, 40,000 microwatts per square meter, which is far away higher than the toxic levels in different studies. As we can see, all ages are affected, but we know from other studies in literature that children in general are more sensitive than grown-ups. And this is of course of concern if you go to like the school situation. I mean, we still have very much use of the wireless technology, and we know that there is an increasing problem with school children with tiredness and headache and so on.
The telecommunications industry is of course the major player pushing for the 5G rollout. 5G is not primarily intended to meet the needs of the public, but rather the needs of the industry. Unfortunately, the industry has shown no interest in the results of our studies and the reported serious health effects of their new 5G technology. Rather, they have taken actions to cover up the health hazards. For instance, a representative from Ericsson, the world-leading provider of 5G base stations, wrote an email to the editor that published our first case study asking for the article to be withdrawn. This is evidence that the industry is working behind the scenes to cover up the health hazards, and it's not interested in any objective investigation of health effects.
They are important, these case reports, because they are the red flags that something is happening. This is the first sign. It's like the Canarian bird down in the mines where they used to have them to see if they reacted on the ambient air quality and could see if they got sick, that, well, it's not good here. And if we look historically, very much of the medical knowledge has started with case studies, like case reports. That's the first sign that something is wrong here. But of course they need to be supplemented with more studies and larger case series and so on.
People are forcibly exposed to this radiation in their own homes without any possibility to say no, without their informed consent, and without any studies showing that it is not harmful. On the contrary, there are increasing evidence that it is harmful, and an increasing number of scientists are warning about the health risks. This situation is, of course, against what we must expect from a democratic society. It shows that the industry has too much influence over how the society handles these risks. It also shows that those organizations and agencies such as the ICNIRP, the World Health Organization, and the European Commission that pretend that they are protecting the public are simply not doing that.
They can say that these levels are below ICNIRP levels, but if you look strictly on 5G from a medical point of view, it shouldn't be there, neither 6G. But the forces against to stop it are extremely strong, of course. Advice would be, of course, to dismantle 5G. I mean, it's a toxic agents that are forced on human beings, because human beings are not asked.